let's get back to the OPEC story. Why do this at all? Why? You're a country with a hell ton of oil under the ground. Just pump it out as fast as you can and make as much money as possible. Well, that's a possibility. And there are many independent states around the planet that have oil and produce it and are not in OPEC. Thank you very much. They make money on the side. But the oil exporting nations in the Middle East decided that they could project much more influence as a single organized entity as opposed to individual states with a whole bunch of oil. Otherwise, if they were all individual states, they'd be competing with each other. What does competition do to price, by the way? And you don't have to be a business major to know this, but there's 12 members of OPEC, and 12 members of OPEC work together, okay, to fix their prices. What happens if 12 members of OPEC were 12 individual countries who all wanted to sell oil individually? They would be competing with each other. And one country might say, well, we think oil's worth $100 a barrel, so we're going to sell it for 100. And the country next door is like, well, we're going to sell it for 99. And the country over here is like, oh, well, we need the money. We'll sell for 98. And someone over here, like Venezuela, is like, well, we're broke. We'll sell for $20. We don't care. We need the money. You see what what competition does in the marketplace? So these states said, we shouldn't compete with each other. We should work together and all collectively set a price, and therefore, we all make more money in the long run. Sound good? Sound good? Huh? Well, at least the original 5 did back in 1960. Now, you can only pull this off if you are kind of a true cartel, meaning you have to control a big enough share of this world resource in order to make an impact. If you collectively only own 10%, nobody's going to care about you because they're just going to get their stuff from the other 90% of producers who are competing with each other. But OPEC members collectively control almost 80% of the world's proven reserves of oil. 80%? We talked about oil in the last lecture, who owns what. OPEC collectively may be up to 80% of proven. The OPEC countries currently produce about 40% of the world's crude oil on any given day. Any day of the week, 40% of all the world's oil comes from one of these 12 members. OPEC's oil exports represent 60% of the total petroleum traded internationally. Now, they produce 40% of the world's. They're the ones that are selling. Of what's sold, they're selling 60% of that. Now, that's more than half. These guys got the majority. That is the lion's share. And because of that, they can and do affect the price of oil. They have the most of it. Again, much like De Beers owns like 90% of the world's diamonds. You own it, then you could say, well, I got most of them, so I will say exactly what this is worth, and you don't want to pay it, well, good luck trying to find it from the other 10%. That's the way that OPEC is. They don't own or sell all of the world's oil. Of course not. But they have the biggest market share of it, which means they can set the price at any given day, and everyone else falls in line. And that's exactly how it's worked for basically the last 50 years. Now, if you're a non-OPEC member, you can sell your oil for cheaper, that's fine, but you're only ripping yourself off. And if you're a non-OPEC member and you want to sell your oil for more, you say, oh, OPEC's selling their oil for $100 a barrel. Well, we think our oil is worth $200 a barrel. That's fine. Nobody's going to buy it. It's too expensive. And you can say, well, OPEC's setting the price at $100 a barrel. I'm going to sell it for $50. That's fine. You're losing $50 on every barrel you sell. So pretty much, OPEC does set the world price because nobody's that foolish as to lose money or not make any money at all. Okay, how do they pull off this coordination? Now I'm going to read directly from the mission statement of OPEC. Always riveting stuff reading from mission statements. Harumph, harumph, harumph. Mission of OPEC, abbreviated. In accordance with its statute, the mission of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries is to coordinate and unify the petroleum policies of its member countries and ensure the stabilization of oil markets in order to secure an efficient, economic, and regular supply of petroleum to consumers, a steady income to producers, and a fair return on capital for those investing in the petroleum industry. Harumph, 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 harumph. Okay? That may be straightforward enough for most of you, but I'll put it into Boyer terms. Here's the basic translation. We, OPEC member states, are going to coordinate between ourselves, amongst ourselves, how much oil we're going to produce every quarter or every year, whatever the time allotment is. And this is not a set amount. And it's not a set amount for each country. So Saudi Arabia, because they have tons and tons of oil, maybe Saudi Arabia is going to produce 1 million barrels of oil this quarter. And Iran's going to produce 750,000 barrels of oil this quarter. And maybe Venezuela will do 500,000 barrels of oil this quarter. And Kuwait will do 350,000. Whatever that number is, okay, they're looking at what's happening in the world, and they say, how much oil does the world need? And then what's our production capacity as individual members? And then we'll allot out how much we'll all make, okay? And they're doing this by predicting demand and tailoring their production as close as possible to the perceived or predicted demand. So we think the world's going to need this much. This much is exactly how much we want to produce. You guys do that much. You guys do this much. Qatar, you do that much. Venezuela, you do that much. See how it works? If you produce too much, then you flood the market with too much oil. And if there's too much of a product, the price goes down. It's easier to get to. It's cheaper. If you produce too little, prices spike and consumers get pissed. And believe it or not, you really never want to piss off your customers too much. This is true in OPEC, just like it is everywhere else. Poor customer service, price gets too high, you piss off people, and they're like, I'm not buying your product anymore. Even though we're all relying on oil, if you piss off the consumer too much, things will happen. More on that in a sec. So, back to OPEC. We, as the largest shareholder of the entire world's oil market, will work together to attempt to produce just the exact right amount of oil the world needs every year so that we minimize price fluctuations, okay? We don't want to be $100 a barrel, $50 a barrel, $100 a barrel, $50 a barrel. No market volatility. So we want to minimize price fluctuations, try to make it about the same all the time, and at the same time maximize steady profits for ourselves and our investors, okay? Yes, we're definitely going to make money. But we want enough money, we want the price high enough so that we make enough money, but without pissing off everybody, without pissing off our customers. Got it? Okay? Now, despite the popular and completely incorrect opinions of the average American, I believe, OPEC does not really want to spike prices super high or have huge price fluctuations for fear that it will piss off their customers. That is a very real worry by all of these groups, or this OPEC group. And this is not a hypothetical. Again, I know a lot of Americans are like, OPEC, they control oil, and they're making $10,000 a barrel just to screw everybody. No, they wouldn't. They don't want to piss you off. Because this is not my guess, it's not my instinct, this is not hypothetical. This is a lesson that they've actually already learned in the past. Because the other component of having this collective oil action that the OPEC countries do is they discovered that not only could they use oil as an economic lever to all make themselves more money and stabilize production and demand and price. So they said, okay, well, that's cool. We have economic power, but they discovered that they also had political power and that they could use oil as a political weapon. And the times they've tried to use it as a political weapon in the past actually did piss everyone off and did change the story for OPEC and for our story of oil in the 20th century. And now I'm going to get to a little history that you hopefully know already. When did this happen that OPEC infuriated the world and changed their own fate? 1973 is the year to know. The oil crisis of 1973, or the 1973-74 oil embargo. It was the first time that OPEC, and by the way, put this caveat in here, put a star in your notes. This is the first time that OPEC used their oil as a political weapon. And here's the thing to asterisk in your notes. It was only the Arab countries of OPEC. So not Iran, they're Persian, and not the other players, not Nigeria, not Venezuela. the Arab countries, which constitute that core that have, honestly, the lion's share of oil within OPEC, they said, we're going to use oil as a political weapon. Okay, how did they do that in 1973? Well, the quick backstory is that in October 17th, 1973, the Arab members of OPEC made a statement on international TV, promised to reduce their oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdrew from occupied territories. Now, we haven't gotten to this yet, but here's the lowdown. These are territories that were taken from Egypt, Syria, and Palestine as a result of Israeli success in a war called the 6 Days War of 1967. So in 1967, there was a war. Israel won that war and took over Palestine, took over parts of Syria, took over parts of Egypt. Okay. Then in 1973, Egypt and Syria declared war on Israel in an attempt to get their territories back. It was called the Yom Kippur War. Okay? And it was a surprise attack in October, the result of which the United States saw this and said, oh, wait a minute, Israel's a huge ally of ours, and they just had a surprise attack on them. So the United States sent a bunch of weapons to Israel to help her defend herself, and this infuriated all of the surrounding Arab countries, the ones pumping a bunch of oil included. So this sparked Arab outrage that the U.S. was helping Israel in this war, and thus the declaration, until Israel pulls out of those occupied territories that they have taken from Syria and Egypt, we're going to start cutting back on oil, and we're going to reduce, in the next 1 year, we're going to reduce our oil output and export by 50%. You probably don't need to be a math major or a business major to figure out what's going to happen there. They made good on their promise, and they started reducing their reducing production, which was reducing their exports, and the price of oil in the world started to go up and up and up and up. By the end of the embargo in March 1974, the price went from $3, 1973, $3 a barrel. I know it's hard to imagine, $3 a barrel for oil in 1973. But by March 1974, it was $12 a barrel. That still seems like chump change to us in today's world, but dig it. That's times 4. Now, whatever the price, whenever you're watching this video, in centuries in the future, here's how I can put it in perspective. Whatever the price of gas is you're paying right now, imagine 2 months from now paying 4 times the price. 4 in a couple months. It made a huge big deal. It was called the first oil shock of the world because everybody's like, whoa, what just happened there? We're used to paying like nothing for gasoline. We've developed our whole economy based on petroleum. And suddenly they're turning the spigot off and everything's costing 4 times as much. There was gas rationing. Ask your parents or your grandparents, maybe your great-grandparents, depending on when you were born. I'm old enough to remember this. You had to take turns at the gas station. You could only get gas, depending on what state you were in, you could only get gas every other day. And depending on if your license plate ended with an even number or an odd number. Some places had gas rationing cards. You're only allowed so much. You'd go cash them in to go to the pump. It was a huge big deal. It affected the economies of all the rich countries because suddenly the price of energy went through the roof, and that affects your factories and your transportation, and everything's like, I mean, huge big shock. And it's at this exact point that I also want you to jot down that the world's rich countries, the rich developed world, figured out instantaneously how screwed they were. Because it had not occurred to anyone until this 1973 oil crisis that countries, even like the United States, that produce tons of oil, had gone from being oil producers, self-sufficient oil producers, and maybe even oil exporters. They had gone from that to being reliant oil importers. All the rich countries were like, oh gosh, we never thought about this. We are entirely reliant on this resource that's located in other parts of the planet, and at that time, other parts of the planet that were pissed off at you. This was followed soon after by a second oil shock in 1979. This one was not as manufactured, but the 1979 or second oil crisis occurred in the United States particularly due to decreased oil output in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. Again, this was not intentional. Iran had a revolution. We'll talk more about that later too. And in the middle of the revolution was like total chaos, and they were overthrowing the government, and people didn't know what was going on and what's happening next. And in all of that chaos, despite the fact that it actually didn't affect world oil resources that much, or oil world supply, it only decreased world oil supply by like 3 or 4%. Despite that it wasn't real, it wasn't a real threat, there was widespread panic. And stock market speculators started driving up the price of oil, and one thing led to another. Now the price of oil is $39 or $40 a barrel. And again, $3 a barrel in 1973. Second oil shock, the price of oil is $40 a barrel. That's a really big deal. And once again, long lines at the gas stations, cards so you can get gas. People are like, oh my God, it's the end of the world. This caused economic instability worldwide, really, but specifically in the United States. So it's so heavily reliant on this for all aspects of life. Okay? So 1973, 1979, basically the 1970s are this kind of shock decade of, whoa, this is really bad. And let me even make it worse. Just as OPEC and the world was recovering from the 70s, Iran and Iraq got into a war with each other. The appropriately named Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. I love when they name them so easy. They're easy to remember, okay? The result of that war between two OPEC members and major oil exporters was that Iranian exports virtually ceased to exist for almost a decade. Full-fledged war, hundreds of thousands of casualties, really nasty war. And Iraq's export capacity was severely diminished. So you have a whole bunch of factors going on that make oil very chaotic in the mid to late 70s and on into the 80s. So you have people stopping oil supply, so there's not enough, and then suddenly people are making too much, and then it's retracting again. So this is throwing everything higgledy-piggledy in the world oil market. Now, remember earlier when I said OPEC really doesn't want huge price spikes or huge price fluctuations or even permanently high prices. Again, it's just a non-fact. Anyone who thinks OPEC wants to charge $1 million a barrel for oil, you're wrong. And they don't want all this fluctuation either, and here's why. With both of those oil shocks, OPEC actually lost a huge amount of influence. Now, they still have a lot in today's world, but they used to have more. How did they lose influence because of all this stuff? Well, when the Arab producers said, well, we're not selling oil to the West anymore because we're pissed off at the United States, prices start to go up. As prices spike, this encourages other businesses and other players to get in the game. For $3, oil exists all over the place, and some of it's clean, and some of it's dirty, and some of it's easy to get to, and some of it's harder to get to. And for $3 a barrel, you may have oil in your country, but maybe it's locked up in shale, or maybe it's dirty, it needs to be refined more. And for $3 a barrel, it's going to take $2.95 to make it market ready. It's not worth it. You're not going to bother with it. Maybe it's offshore. You can't get to it without massive investment. For $3 a barrel, not worth it. $4 a barrel, $10 a barrel. Now, wait a minute. Now that we might be able to turn a profit on that now. $40 a barrel? Okay, hang on. We're coming. So what you have is these price spikes encourage lots of other countries and businesses around the world to say, oh, we'll start producing oil. The Arab countries don't want to sell it? Good. We'll sell ours. So places like Mexico started going gangbusters with oil. In the 1970s, they were not a major oil producer before then because their oil is offshore and it's not as clean and they have to process it. It wasn't worth $10 a barrel, $40 a barrel. Yeah, we'll do that all day long. Other OPEC members that were the non-Arab states, they said, well, we need the money, so we don't care. The Arabs are making a political statement. We're not. So Venezuela and Nigeria, they went gangbusters and produced even more. And you had non-OPEC players like the USSR, it's now Russia, but the USSR at the time, and still has hell tons of oil resources. It's still a major breadwinner for the Russian government here in the 21st century. Back in 1980, the USSR was going broke. So they're like, oh, we have tons of oil and suddenly it's worth 40 or 50 or $60 a barrel. go, 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 go time. That's when Russia started to become a major producer, and they haven't turned back since. Even places like Norway and the United Kingdom started to explore more and invest more in North Sea oil production, and they got into the game. Even in America, Texas had a rejuvenated industry in the 70s and 80s. We built this pipeline across Alaska. Ever heard of the Alaskan oil pipeline? That was a result of all this. Suddenly it's like, wow, you can make a bunch of money in oil. And more people started doing it. So OPEC lost market share because so many other entities jumped in and started producing more. On top of that, it pissed off consumers so much that it kind of started to launch an era of conservation in America and other places, Europe more so than America, where people said, hey, maybe we don't want to be this reliant on this product. Maybe we should look for alternative energy resources. Maybe we shouldn't drive our cars as much. Maybe we should use public transportation. Maybe we should invest in solar energy. Maybe we should invest in wind energy. You see where all the tree hugging, bunny hugging stuff. And by the way, I'm a fan of alternative energy resources, but do you think Saudi Arabia is? Do you think OPEC is? They don't want any of that stuff. They don't want you saving electricity. They want you to be wasteful. They don't want anybody figuring out a brand new energy source that's renewable that anybody could have. So that also affected demand. You're going to conserve more and start looking for alternatives. Then we don't need as much oil, which means OPEC loses more influence. And finally, there are increases in technology, not just alternative energy, but increases in oil technology that open other options for oil that was otherwise unobtainable, inaccessible, or too costly to get to. And I'm thinking particularly here of, say, the oil shales of Canada, that for $3 or $4 or $5 a barrel, it's like, nah. Oh, but we got this new technology. For $10 we can even turn a profit. Yeah, so advances in technology led to deeper offshore drilling. Cool. And this thing that's happening in America here in the 21st century called fracking. Brand new technology invented by the Americans. It's hydraulic fracturing, for those that really want the technical term, where they can go in and figure out where small pockets of oil and gas are and inject chemicals and stuff into it, force the oil out. That's all because of technological prowess that's opened up fields of oil resources that were just unobtainable before. So if you push too hard, if the price goes too high, if you piss off your customers too much, they'll figure out how to get oil from other countries or from other sources within their country, or they'll try to get off oil altogether. See how that works? So since the sloppy 1970s of skyrocketing, then slumping oil prices, OPEC has sought to actively manage oil production in its member countries by setting production targets, like we talked about. You guys make this much, you guys make that much, we'll make this much, which in turn means they can pick the price they all collectively sell their oil for. And they are much more hesitant to use oil as a political weapon. It still happens, my friends. It still happens, but nothing as huge, as straightforward, and with this huge impact to the entire world as that 1973 oil embargo.